The DCU used to gross between $800 million and $1 billion per movie at the box office, and had everything to compete with Marvel. But this shared universe ended badly. It hit rock bottom to the point that Warner had to reboot the entire universe before closing the story arcs of its main characters. They fired their most important actors. No one wants to work for DC, and their last 7 movies were box office flops.
All went wrong.
Let's talk about the rise and fall of the DCU. It all started in 2010, when DC was a very well-established brand. Batman Begins had been loved by everyone, and The Dark Knight just became the highest-grossing superhero movie in history. So DC was a synonym of quality and money. Their animated universe was 1,000 times better than Marvel's, except for Earth's Mightiest Heroes. The Arkham Saga was an absolute success, and in previous decades they had win after win. Christopher Reeve's Superman had been a hit, Linda Carter's Series 2, and even the Flash series of the 90s and Smallville had been well received. The only area in which DC was losing was in the sale of comics in the US. It was the only area where they were outperformed by Marvel. But since the big profits are not in comic book sales, no DC executive cared about this.
All they care about is money.
But DC's superiority wasn't going to last forever. Seeing the success of Iron Man in 2008, Warner saw that the competition could catch up and overtake them in a couple of years. Marvel Studios was introducing a shared universe in cinemas for the first time, replicating the comic book formula. They didn't do standalone movies. They made crossovers with all the characters together. Nowadays, it's the most normal thing in the world. But in the early 2000s, all the Hollywood studios thought the idea would be a failure until Marvel proved it could be done.
Best idea ever!
DC was 2 steps behind, but they had an ace up their sleeve: the movie rights to all their characters. Marvel couldn't use their biggest heroes, like Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four, because their rights were owned by other studios. But if Warner wanted to, they could use the Justice League, the Teen Titans, the Legion of Superheroes, and the Doom Patrol with no problems. They could replicate Marvel's success faster than Marvel. Warner tried to convince Christopher Nolan to feature more superheroes in his Batman saga, but the director refused, so they started from scratch with the most important superhero in history, Superman. They chose Zack Snyder as director because he was one of Warner's most trusted men at the time. Snyder had directed Watchmen and 300, 2 comic book adaptations that had pleased some fans and had been applauded by critics. Snyder knew how to adapt comic book concepts and add his own touch to them. He seemed to be the right guy for DC to maintain its quality brand, but now in a shared universe.
I am the chosen one.
Man of Steel's production began in 2010, and the film hit theaters in 2013, a year after The Dark Knight. It grossed $668 million, more than any DC film ever except for The Dark Knight. Not everyone loved it, because some said this wasn't their Superman, or that it was unacceptable for the Man of Steel to kill. But overall, the reception was good. The soundtrack was great, the special effects were spectacular, and it delivered as an origin story. It held up pretty good over the years, and was successful enough that Warner decided to continue with that universe, with Henry Cavill's Superman as the main figure and Zack Snyder in charge of the story. So they greenlit Batman v Superman. This film's announcement at Comic-Con in 2013 was crazy. It would be the first movie crossover of the 2 biggest superheroes in the world, and it would include nods to The Dark Knight Returns, one of the best Batman comics ever. Many had doubts about Ben Affleck's casting as Bruce Wayne, because his version of Daredevil had been awful, but the level of hype surrounding Batman v Superman was superior to that of Avengers 1. To kill the 3-year wait between the announcement and the release of the film, Warner announced more projects of this shared universe: Suicide Squad, Flash, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and Justice League. It was all looking good because it would be a short time before we would see the Justice League together in theaters. But then Batman v Superman quickly became the most controversial superhero movie in history. Some people loved it immediately and said it was the best thing DC had ever made, and one of the best superhero movies ever made. Snyder was the second coming of Christ, but another part of the audience hated the movie because of the Martha scene, the characterization of Batman and Superman, the stilted conflict, the depressing tone, how useless Lois Lane is, Superman's premature death, and a Lex Luthor that looked more like the Joker.
Martha.
This was just the second DCU project, but it wasn't equivalent to Thor 1, which was the second MCU project. DC put their 2 most important characters together, threw in Wonder Woman, and also introduced the entire Justice League. This was their Avengers 1, but people didn't come out loving it like they did with Avengers. It didn't even get the lukewarm reception of Age of Ultron. A portion of the audience left the cinema cursing after seeing Batman v Superman, but at least it did well at the box office. Or did it? Batman v Superman grossed $870 million. It was more than profitable, but it fell short of the $1 billion billion that any Avengers films used to gross, and fell short of being the biggest crossover in history. To top it off, Marvel released their own Batman v Superman 2 months later, also facing their most important heroes, and they grossed 1.5 billion, and people liked it.
Why can't I be like you?
Warner panicked. Maybe the problem had been the tone, the director, the script, the expectations, or rushing to compete with Marvel. They could fix that for Justice League, but Suicide Squad was going to be released in August that very same year. The film had the same tone as Batman v Superman and featured Ben Affleck's Batman, so they did what any sensible studio would do: hire a team of trailer editors to remake the entire film and distance it from Batman v Superman.
Did it ever occur to you that I might just be that stupid?
To everyone's surprise, Suicide Squad was not a box office flop. It grossed 746 million, more than Man of Steel with a smaller budget. But the reactions were
crap, mega crap.
Suicide Squad gets to the top in every single rank of worst superhero movies ever. Did you hate Batman v Superman? You probably hated Suicide Squad too. Did you love Batman v Superman? You probably also hated Suicide Squad. Warner panicked again because they weren't doing bad at the box office, but it was only a matter of time before audiences abandoned them. How many more times were we going to go to the movies to leave disappointed? It's not like tickets were free, and even if they were free, no one wants to go to the cinema to see 2 hours of crap. On top of that, The Flash was having production problems and was delayed indefinitely. But then they did one thing right. In June 2017 came Wonder Woman, which had been one of the best parts of Batman v Superman. The movie had no direct connections to Snyder's film because Diana's story took place in the past. It was a well-told origin story with good special effects, and it followed the fish out of water formula, just like Thor 1, but it did it better than Thor. Wonder Woman grossed 822 million, and it became a huge success for Warner because this time people loved the movie. The critics loved it, Snyder fans loved it, Snyder haters loved it, and most importantly, the general audience liked the character and were willing to see Diana again.
Love her. Love her.
It's as if Warner had gone back in time to late 2013 when the audience had hopes for the DCEU and everyone wanted to see a crossover after the success of Man of Steel. That suited them just fine because after Wonder Woman, they were going to release Justice League, and that movie had to do well no matter what. They had a second chance, and they blew it. Despite the Batman v Superman controversy, Warner kept Snyder as the director of Justice League and went ahead with their plan. Zack wanted to make 2 Justice League movies in which Superman would be revived, Darkseid would attack Earth and control the Man of Steel, and finally, the heroes would defeat the villain. However, they didn't shoot the 2 films at the same time, as happened with Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions. They were going to make one film at a time, something that already showed that Warner didn't have all the faith in the world in this project.
I don't trust you.
Still, the script was ready, Snyder was in charge of filming, post-production started, and we saw a first preview at the 2016 Comic-Con. But then, the director had to abandon the project due to the death of his daughter. This is where all the conspiracy theories start. Some believe that Warner used this tragedy as an excuse to push Snyder aside because they didn't trust his vision for the DCU. Justice League was going to have a similar tone to Batman v Superman, so the studio feared that the reactions would be similar to the ones in 2016, and they tried to change everything on the fly, like they had done with Suicide Squad.
There's something familiar about all this.
And I'm sure you've noticed something doesn't add up. If Warner didn't trust Snyder after Batman v Superman, why did they hire him again to direct the most important film in the DCU? They could have changed directors before they started working on Justice League and avoid all this problems. There is an explanation for that. In 2016, AT&T, the phone company, bought Warner. This led to a restructuring of the entire company, mainly in senior positions. Walter Hamada, who had worked at Warner since the 2000s, gained a ton of power, and good old Walter wasn't very convinced by Snyder's vision of superheroes. He wanted to see brighter characters, something closer to the comics, so it was obvious that he wasn't going to continue with Snyder's plans anytime soon.
But I am the chosen one.
There's no way of knowing if Hamada and company took advantage of the tragedy in Snyder's life to pivot, or if they were going to do it anyway. What we do know is that as soon as Snyder was out of the project, they brought in Joss Whedon, the director of Avengers 1 and 2, and Jeff Johns, one of the most important comic book writers in recent history. They were going to finish the post-production of Justice League, and everybody keeps saying the same thing, that this was a mistake because they shouldn't have replaced Snyder. But what did they want Warner to do? Snyder didn't sprain his ankle. He had just gone through one of the most traumatic situations a person can go through. No one knew if he would ever direct again, and if he did come back, he could be able to do it 5 years later. Warner couldn't hold up production on Justice League indefinitely. They had already released a trailer, announced a release date, booked theaters, and got fans excited. They were going to lose hundreds of millions of dollars if they waited indefinitely.
I want my money back.
As insensitive as it sounds, sounds, it made sense to replace Snyder because this wasn't an independent B-movie project. But that doesn't mean they got it right. Instead of simply finishing post-production, Joss Whedon made reshoots for 2 months. The goal was to change the tone of the film to make it more family-friendly, and also to leave out any promise of Justice League Part 2, because Warner wanted to restructure the entire DCU, and they weren't planning on calling back Zack Snyder to continue his story. This turned out like crap. Joss Whedon told Warner that he needed more time to remake the film the way the studio wanted, but Warner didn't want to change the dates, so the end result was a Frankenstein monster no one liked. The shift in tone didn't work, the reshoots felt out of place, there were several unresolved subplots, the story of the Russian family felt shoehorned in, and the special effects were half finished. The only redeemable thing about this movie was seeing Superman being a hero, something Henry Cavill himself said he really liked.
That's my hero.
Too bad we also saw him with a CGI-covered mustache. Justice League grossed $657 million, the worst box office result of the entire DCU up to that point, something twice as serious because it had also been the most expensive project. Everybody's reactions were horrible, comparable to what happened with Suicide Squad, but in this case, the repercussions would be much worse. This was DC's most important film, and people hadn't liked it one bit. It's as if Avengers 1 had been a failure at the box office and audience reception. The MCU would have died in Phase 1. The following months were terrible because Ray Fisher, who played Cyborg, denounced Joss Whedon for labor abuse. Gal Gadot also complained. Warner fired Fisher. Whedon was cancelled on social media. Accusations were shot from all sides. Jeff Johns was caught in the crossfire. There was a power struggle at Warner. Ben Affleck said he wouldn't be Batman again, and it seemed like things couldn't get any worse. The DCU should have been dead in 2017, but DC has more lives than a cat. In 2018, they released Aquaman, which had been filmed in 2017. Being a sequel to Justice League, it had everything to be a flop, but Warner had to release it anyway because they already had finished the movie. Surprisingly, it did well. Sorry, well is an understatement. It did remarkably well. Aquaman grossed $1.1 billion. It became the highest grossing film in the DCU by far, and also the highest grossing film in DC's history, even more than Nolan's Batman. Wow. There wasn't a lot of hype around the movie, and critics thought it was so-so, but casual audiences loved it. It was a typical superhero origin story, but it worked, just like Man of Steel and Wonder Woman. Plus, the underwater sequences were excellent, something we'd never seen before. But of course, Aquaman wasn't going to do magic. People were still wary of the DC brand after so many flops and disappointments, and the fandom of the shared universe had disappeared. But if Aquaman had topped $1 billion thanks to a refreshing story that the general public had liked, then not everything was lost for this universe. DC had a third chance.
Third time's the charm, right?
DC focused on standalone movies with lighter tone and smaller budgets, like Shazam and Birds of Prey. Shazam was a fun comedy for the whole family, and people liked it. It even fed the hype a bit because the last scene featured Henry Cavill's Superman, or someone wearing Cavill's Superman suit. The movie grossed $367 million, less than any other DCU project up to that point, but it barely cost $100 million, not over $300 like Justice League. So it was profitable for Warner. It wasn't a big hit, but it made some money.
I like money.
Birds of Prey was even cheaper, just $84 million, but fell short at the box office, grossing only $205 million. Warner wanted to target the female audience and Harley Quinn fans, of which there are many, but that wasn't enough.
Why not?
This was a sequel to the worst film in the DCU. It was obvious that people wouldn't want to go to the cinema to see Birds of Prey because they still had the bad taste in their mouths from Suicide Squad. Also, a month after the premiere, the pandemic started and cinemas all over the world were closed.
Bad luck.
Wonder Woman 2, the sequel to one of the most successful films of this universe, was supposed to hit theaters in June 2020, but the apocalypse complicated things. With the emergence of streaming as a possible replacement for cinema, Warner made a simultaneous release in December 2020. Wonder Woman 2 hit a few theaters, and the same day it premiered on HBO Max. That explains the pathetic $169 million it grossed. What did they expect? Theaters were closed almost everywhere in the planet. They should have waited a couple months so people could actually go to the cinema to watch the movie. But there was another problem. Reactions were not the same as the first part, because Wonder Woman 1984 was not as good as the first part. It didn't destroy the character's image, or what little fandom there was, but it didn't help either. It didn't make people fall in love with DC again, and nobody asked for a Wonder Woman 3.
Oh, I don't want to see that.
And Warner had one more problem. Since Justice League premiered in 2017, a group of Snyder fans made their presence felt on social media with the hashtag Release the Snyder Cut. They wanted to see the director's cut because they felt that Warner had robbed them. No DC executive responded to these requests except Snyder himself, who implied that his version was very different from the one seen in theaters, and not only because of the tone. There was unreleased footage that we had not been able to see.
I want to see it.
Warner had two choices: ignore the fan campaign and continue business as usual, or finish post-production on Snyder's Justice League in an attempt to recover Snyder's fans. It was was a fourth chance to return to their glory days, because despite all the controversy, Snyder's 2 films had been successful at the box office, but the deciding factor was the pandemic. In early 2020, all Hollywood filming stopped, and no one knew when it would resume. Most studios tried to launch their own Netflix, believing that streaming would be a great source of profit in the short, medium, and long term, but they had nothing to release because there was no filming to be done. Of course, Warner did have something. There was an entire film that had already been shot, with a director who wanted to finish the job, and a fan base that wanted to see it. A fan base that was doing free promotion for Snyder's Justice League and would surely subscribe to HBO Max. So Warner's listened to the fans. They invested another $70 million into Snyder's Justice League to finish post-production, and in March 2021, the director's cut came to HBO Max.
I got what I wanted.
Snyder's Justice League was a hit. It became the 4th most watched film on streaming in 2021 and had a much better reception than the theatrical version. Even some Snyder detractors admitted it was good, but the studio didn't do so well with this move. They gained subscribers on HBO Max, but those who supported the hashtag didn't forgive the studio. They felt empowered, and now they were asking for more. They wanted to see Justice League Part 2 so that Snyder would finish his story, but that was impossible.
My God, why?
Snyder didn't want to continue working with Warner, and Warner executives had no interest in continuing the story of that universe. Jim Lee, one of DC's heavyweights, said that the canon version was Whedon's version. Now that the pandemic was ending and they could film new projects, there was no reason to keep Snyder's fans happy, because DC had one more card left. James Gunn, Kevin Feige's right-hand man at Marvel, had been fired by Disney after someone discovered some tasteless tweets he had posted years ago. Disney rehired him soon after to bring closure to the Guardians saga, but Gunn wouldn't continue working for Marvel after that, so DC jumped at the chance and gave him a position at their studio. They told him he could do any movie he wanted, and the guy wanted to do a soft reboot of Suicide Squad.
What?
It seemed like a very stupid decision, but this group of characters was perfect for James Gunn, who is a comic book geek, loves unknown characters, and likes to use humor and lots of violence. His new Suicide Squad hit theaters and HBO Max in August 2021, and the reactions were super positive. It's one of the best rated films of the entire DCU. It has good special effects, good action scenes, it's super comic booky, the characters are well characterized, and you get attached to everyone, but it didn't do well at the box office. It grossed $168 million, pretty much the same as Wonder Woman 1984. We can blame it on the pandemic, the simultaneous release on HBO Max, or that people wanted nothing to do with this group after the 2016 disaster. But no matter the reason, it was clear that audiences were letting go of this shared universe. Black Widow also hit theaters during the pandemic and had simultaneous theatrical and Disney Plus release, and grossed $379 million. Double the money the Suicide Squad made, and Black Widow didn't even get very good ratings from people. But Warner still had faith in James Gunn, so they put him in charge of the first DCU series. A weird project for the second time. Peacemaker was announced as a spin-off of the Suicide Squad, starring a secondary character who was quite unlikable, but Gunn surprised us again. The series was very good. It had everything that made the Suicide Squad great, and even though it didn't have a big audience at the beginning, the last few episodes picked up thanks to word of mouth. It became one of the highest rated projects in the DCU, and it pointed the way forward. DC could succeed with a similar tone to Guardians of the Galaxy, moving away from Batman v Superman and the Justice League controversy. But how are they going to make people forget all that if they kept using the same actors? Easy. Stop using the same actors.
You are a genius.
At the beginning of the video, I told you that The Flash had been in pre-production for years. Well, in 2020, Warner finally started filming. The idea was to make a fairly loose adaptation of Flashpoint, which Hamada would use to restructure the universe and leave behind everything related to Snyder. Ben Affleck and Henry Cavill would be replaced by Michael Keaton's Batman and Sasha Calle's Supergirl, a very controversial decision, but one that would give complete creative freedom to new people, and it would also separate the new universe from the Snyderverse. But things got even more complicated. Warner was producing several DC projects: Black Adam, The Flash, Shazam 2, Batgirl, and Blue Beetle, but all of them were affected by the merger with Discovery in April 2022, and the following decisions of the new CEO, David Zaslav.
Confusing!
Zaslav canceled Batgirl because it was supposedly too bad, and moved Blue Beetle to theaters because it was too good for HBO Max. And that wasn't all. Dwayne Johnson, who had worked on Black Adam for more than 10 years, convinced Zaslav to include Henry Cavill in the film. The Rock wasn't doing Cavill any favors. All he wanted was to gain power at Warner Brothers by turning Black Adam into the second most important character in the DCU, making him fight toe-to-toe with Superman. Zaslav liked the idea, and they shoehorned in Cavill for a last-minute cameo. A A couple of days later, Henry announced on his Instagram profile that he was very happy to be Superman again because he hadn't filmed any scenes as the Man of Steel since 2017. But happiness didn't last. Black Adam was well received by fans. It didn't have a super original story, nor did it reinvent the superhero genre, but it was fun and had good action sequences. It grossed $390 million, more than Wonder Woman, Birds of Prey, Shazam, and the Suicide Squad, but it failed to be profitable because it cost over $200 million, not counting the marketing campaign. DC had failed at the box office again, and they couldn't use the apocalypse as an excuse. Dwayne Johnson's star power failed to put butts on the cinema seats, and Cavill's cameo did nothing to sell tickets. Zaslav felt there was no point in continuing the Snyderverse, but they couldn't go back to Hamada's plan. Erasing Superman and recasting Batman for a 70-year-old was the stupidest idea in the world.
That's the worst idea I've ever heard.
Seeing that James Gunn's projects were the highest rated in the DCU, Zaslav made Gunn the president of DC, along with Peter Safran, who would be in charge of the money. Gunn was given complete freedom to do whatever he wanted, so he announced a soft reboot in late 2022, similar to what Hamada wanted to do, but even more confusing. Cavill was left out of the new DCU, The Rock was left out too, and the following DC projects were abandoned to their own fate. Shazam 2 had minimal promotion, and despite being decent, it only grossed $130 million, less than half of what the first one had made in the box office. The Flash became the biggest flop in the entire history of superhero movies and a complete joke because of the terrible visual effects, and to top it off, that movie didn't even reboot the universe. The last scene is a joke with Clooney's Batman.
That is not funny.
Blue Beetle, which was released in theaters to make some money, barely made over $100 million and couldn't be saved by memes. Audiences recognized that it was good, but a large portion of people are no longer willing to spend their money to see a DC project in theaters. Why do that after so many disappointments, so many changes in direction, in ownership, tone, and actors? We still don't know what is part of the official canon and what isn't, or which actors will be back in James Gunn's new DCU.
I'm so confused.
The last nail in the coffin was Aquaman 2. The first movie had grossed over $1 billion, but The Lost Kingdom only managed to gross $430 million. Not even China could save it, and they love Jason Momoa there. The problem was that no one was interested in watching the last film of a dead universe, even though Aquaman 1 had been well liked. The sequel wasn't bad, but after seeing Avatar 2, the bar was set incredibly high for movies with scenes underwater. The Lost Kingdom has an open ending, suggesting that Aquaman may return in the future, but the post-credit scene is a joke, with Arthur's brother eating a cockroach. I decided to interpret this as an analogy for what we DC fans have been enduring, eating garbage and bad decisions for years.
Metaphor.
The recent history of DC movies is very sad, but if they fell and got back up 3 times, they can do it again with the new Superman movie that comes out next year, assuming they don't make the same mistakes as before or the mistakes Marvel is doing right now. It's almost funny that a lot of the bad decisions Warner took were due to the fact that they were trying to mimic the success of the MCU, but right now, Marvel is not in the best place possible. They've struggled since Endgame, and I explain why in this video over here.
Bye.